The silence of a house you've lived in for 34 years has a specific weight. It isn't the absence of sound, it's the presence of history. I know which floorboard in the hallway near the linen closet groans under a light step, and I know exactly how long the faucet in the guest bathroom drips after my son, Julian, forgets to tighten it. I was in the kitchen, methodically folding the linen napkins we use for Sunday dinners, the heavy cream-colored ones that require starch and a steady hand. My husband, Arthur, was supposed to be at the club, and our daughter-in-law, Chloe, was allegedly at a Pilates session. My son was at work, or so the world believed. I didn't hear them at first. I felt them. A shift in the air, a vibration in the wood of the house that felt incorrect. It was a Tuesday at 3 p.m, the hour where the sun hits the stained glass in the entryway and throws bruised purples and blood reds across the hardwood. I moved toward the stairs. I didn't move like a woman in a thriller. I didn't tiptoe or hold my breath. I moved with the heavy, automatic grace of a woman who had spent 3 decades keeping these floors clean. I reached the landing, my hand resting on the banister, the mahogany grain cool and familiar under my palm. The door to the guest room was ajar, just an inch. I didn't see a silhouette or a shadow. I saw a reflection in the vanity mirror that sits angled toward the door. I saw Arthur, my husband of 34 years, the man who still complains if his eggs are 30 seconds over easy. And I saw Chloe, the woman Julian had married 2 years ago with my blessing and my pearls around her neck. In films, women scream. They throw vases. They demand explanations. But as I stood there, watching the rhythmic, desperate betrayal reflected in the silver-backed glass, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. It was the peace of a structure finally collapsing after years of internal rot.
I realized, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins, that I didn't want to stop them. To stop them would be to invite a conversation. To invite a conversation would be to acknowledge that I still had something to lose. I turned around. I walked back down the stairs, making sure my heels hit the wood with their usual rhythmic thud. I went back to the kitchen. I finished the last 2 napkins. I placed them in the drawer, perfectly aligned. Then, I sat at the small escritoire in the corner of the breakfast nook, the place where I keep the grocery lists, the dry cleaning receipts, and the utility bills. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and a black ink pen. I didn't start a letter of accusation. I started a ledger. Item 1. The house. Purchased 1992. Down payment provided by my father's inheritance. Item 2. Arthur's investment account. Managed by me since 2004. Password, our wedding anniversary. Item 3. The beach property. Titled in both names but maintained solely through my private earnings from the years I worked the books for the firm. By the time I heard the floorboard groan upstairs, the one near the linen closet, I had 4 pages of notes. "Elena, you're home early." Arthur's voice drifted down the stairs. It was his performance voice, sturdy, authoritative, slightly annoyed at the disruption of his solitude. I didn't look up. I listened to the sounds of him adjusting his belt, the sound of his shoes clicking. A moment later, Chloe's voice followed, light and airy, like a bird that didn't know it was trapped in a cage. "Oh, hi, Elena. I just dropped by to pick up that sourdough starter you promised. Arthur was just showing me the leak in the guest ceiling." I finally looked up. Arthur was standing in the archway, smoothing his silver hair. Chloe stood behind him, adjusting the strap of her gym bag, her cheeks flushed with a heat that had nothing to do with Pilates. "The leak," I repeated. My voice was level. It sounded like the voice I used to tell the gardener where to plant the hydrangeas. "I haven't noticed a leak." "It's subtle," Arthur said, crossing to the refrigerator. He didn't look at me. He never really looks at me anymore. He looks at the space I occupy. I'll have to get someone in to look at it. Professional. Don't worry about it, Elle. I'm not worried, I said. Chloe stepped forward, her smile too wide, showing too much of her perfect, expensive teeth. You're so lucky, Elena. Arthur is so attentive to the house. Julian is, well, you know Julian. He'd let the roof fall in before he noticed a drip. She laughed. It was a conspiratorial sound, inviting me to join her in a gentle mockery of my own son. My son who worshipped her. My son who had spent his childhood trailing after me, asking why Dad was always so angry. I know exactly what Julian notices, I said. I stood up, slowly. I didn't hide the legal pad. I didn't tuck it away like a guilty secret. I left it lying right there on the desk, the top page covered in my precise architectural handwriting. Arthur glanced at it as he poured himself a glass of water. "Doing the taxes early?" he asked, his back to me. "In a way," I replied. "Dinner at 6?" he asked. It wasn't a question. It was a command disguised as a routine. "No," I said. The silence that followed was heavy. The refrigerator hummed. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked, once, twice, 3 times. Arthur turned around, the glass of water halfway to his lips. Chloe's smile flickered, then died. "No?" Arthur asked, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean, no? We're seeing the Millers at 7:30. "I have some paperwork to finish," I said, picking up the legal pad and the pen. I tucked them under my arm. "I've ordered a car. I'm going to stay at the downtown apartment for a few days, the one we usually rent out to the associates." "The apartment?" Arthur's voice rose just a fraction. This was the small humiliation he hated, a break in the narrative of his perfect life. "It's empty. It's cold. Why on earth would you go there?" "Because," I said, walking toward the hallway, passing so close to Chloe that I could smell her perfume, a sharp, cloying lily of the valley that Arthur had bought her for Christmas. I stopped right next to her. I didn't look at her face. I looked at the pearls around her neck. My mother's pearls. "Because," I continued, my voice a whisper that only the two of them could hear, "I found a leak. And I think it's going to take a lot more than a professional to fix what's about to come through the ceiling." I walked past them without waiting for a response. I didn't go to my bedroom to pack a suitcase. I had already packed a small bag 2 weeks ago, hidden in the back of the coat closet, the day I first noticed Chloe's perfume lingering on Arthur's suit jackets. As I reached the front door, I heard Arthur call my name. It wasn't a call of love. It was a call of ownership. I didn't turn back. I stepped out into the humid afternoon air, the bruised purple light of the entryway finally fading into the gray of twilight. I got into the waiting car. As we pulled away, I looked back at the house. The lights were on in the kitchen. I could see the two of them through the window, 2 silhouettes standing perfectly still, wondering if the silence was a fluke or if the foundation had finally given way. I opened my legal pad to the 5th page. Item 4. The hidden offshore account Arthur thinks I don't know about. I began to write. The downtown apartment smelled of industrial lavender and stale air conditioning. It was a space designed for people passing through, associates who worked too late to commute, or consultants who stayed for a week and left no trace of their existence. It was the perfect place for me. In our house, every object had a memory attached to it like a burr. Here, the surfaces were glass and brushed steel, reflecting nothing but the cold, clinical light of the city. I spent the first night sitting on the edge of the king-sized bed, still wearing my coat. My phone sat on the glass nightstand, vibrating with the frantic persistence of a trapped insect. Arthur called 4 times. Julian called 3. I didn't answer. I watched the city lights flicker through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I thought about the sheer amount of work it takes to keep a lie afloat. For years, I had been the one providing the buoyancy. I scheduled the dinners, I sent the flowers, I reminded Arthur of his own children's birthdays. I was the silent engine of his reputation. Without me there to maintain the decorum, the lie was beginning to take on water. At 10 p.m., a text arrived from Julian. "Mom, Dad says you're at the associate flat. Is everything okay? Chloe said you seemed off today. Also, did you find that sourdough starter? Chloe wanted to bake tomorrow." I looked at the screen until it went dark. Chloe wanted to bake. The psychological audacity of it was almost impressive. She had been in my guest room, in my husband's arms, and her primary concern afterward was the domestic prop she needed to maintain her image as the perfect daughter-in-law. She wanted my starter, the one I'd kept alive for 12 years, to prove she was a part of the family. I realized then that they didn't see me as a person with feelings to be hurt. I was a service provider. I was the infrastructure of their lives. When the infrastructure fails, you don't weep for it. You get annoyed that the lights won't turn on. The next morning, I woke up early. I didn't make coffee. I didn't check the news. I sat at the small glass desk and opened my legal pad. Item 5, the family trust. I knew the bylaws better than Arthur did. He had signed the documents I put in front of him for decades, trusting my eye for detail so he could focus on his golf handicap and his consulting. He didn't realize that by delegating the boredom of administration to me, he had handed me the keys to his kingdom. My phone rang. It was Julian again. This time, I answered. "Mom, thank God, I've been calling for hours." His voice was tight, the tone he used when he was stressed at the firm. "Good morning, Julian," I said. My voice was as smooth as polished stone. "Is Dad okay? He sounds, I don't know, erratic. He said you walked out over a leak in the ceiling? He's making no sense, Mom, and Chloe is upset because she thinks she offended you yesterday." "Upset?" I asked. I stood up and walked to the window. Below, the morning traffic was a slow-motion river of steel. "Why would she think she offended me?" "I don't know. She's sensitive, Mom. You know how she is. She said you looked at her strangely. Look, can you just come home? We were supposed to do the planning for Dad's retirement gala tonight. The caterers are calling." The retirement gala. 35 years at the firm. A legacy of integrity and leadership. "I'm not coming home tonight, Julian," I said. "Mom, don't be difficult. Whatever Dad did he forget an anniversary? Did he buy the wrong wine? Just tell him so he can apologize and we can get back to normal. This is a big week for him." Normal. "Julian," I said, and for the first time, I let a sliver of the coldness through. "Do you remember when you were 6 and you fell off the swing set? You broke your arm, but you didn't cry. You just walked into the kitchen and told me, 'Mom, I think I'm broken.' What does that have to do with—" "I'm not the one who's broken this time," I interrupted. "And I'm not the one who's going to fix it. Tell Chloe the sourdough starter is in the back of the fridge. If she wants it, she'll have to feed it herself. It dies if you don't take care of it." I hung up before he could respond. The emotional escalation was subtle, but I felt it. The shift from the mother who accommodates to the woman who observes. By refusing to play the role of the peacemaker, I was forcing them to deal with each other without my mediation. An hour later, there was a knock at the apartment door. Not a frantic pounding, but a controlled, rhythmic rapping. Arthur. I opened the door. He was dressed in his charcoal suit, looking every bit the distinguished patriarch. But his eyes were restless. He walked past me into the small living area, surveying the sterile furniture with disdain. "This is ridiculous, Elena," he said, not looking at me. "I've told the Millers you have a touch of the flu. You'll stay here today, clear your head, and I'll pick you up at 5 for the committee meeting." He spoke as if he were issuing a memo. He was trying to manage the situation back into a shape he recognized. "I'm not going to the meeting, Arthur," I said, closing the door. He turned, his face reddening. "Enough of this. If this is about yesterday, if you're upset about the house maintenance or whatever you think you saw—" "I don't think I saw anything, Arthur," I said softly. He froze. The silence in the room became absolute. I watched the way his jaw tightened, the way his hand twitched toward his tie. He was calculating. He was wondering how much I knew, and more importantly, how much I could prove. "Elena," he started, his voice dropping an octave, shifting into a tone of manipulative tenderness. "You've been under a lot of stress. The move, the kids, your mother's passing last year. It's natural to imagine things, to misinterpret a moment of..." "A moment of what?" I asked. I took a step toward him. "A moment of comfort? A moment of fixing the leak?" He didn't flinch, but I saw the flicker of fear in his pupils. "Chloe is family. She's Julian's wife." "To even suggest—" "I haven't suggested anything," I said. "You're the one providing the labels, Arthur. I'm just the woman who is no longer doing your laundry." I walked over to the desk and picked up my legal pad. I held it against my chest like a shield. "I have the signatures for the redistribution of the trust assets," I said. "The ones you signed last month when you told me you were too busy to read the boring paperwork." Arthur's face went from red to a sickly ashen gray. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the paperwork, Arthur," I said. "I've only just started it." I went to the door and opened it wide. "Go to your meeting. Tell them I'm still sick. It's not even a lie. I've been sick for a very long time, and I only just realized the cure was leaving the house." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing. He wanted to scream. He wanted to demand his power back. But he couldn't. Not here. Not with the risk of an associate walking past. He adjusted his cufflinks, regained his posture, and walked out without another word. As the door clicked shut, I felt a wave of exhaustion so deep it felt skeletal. But beneath it, there was a curiosity. I wondered how long it would take for Julian to realize that his wife and his father weren't just close. And I wondered if, when the truth finally came out, he would turn to me for comfort, or if he would blame me for finally stopping the engine that kept his world running. I looked down at my pad. Item 6, the security camera footage from the hallway. I hadn't looked at it yet. I didn't need to. But I knew exactly where the server was hidden. The second day in the apartment was marked by the arrival of the dry cleaning. Or, rather, the lack of it. My phone rang at noon. It was the landline of the apartment, a number almost no one had. I picked it up, expecting a solicitor. It was Arthur's secretary, Brenda. She has worked for him for 15 years. And in all that time, she has called me only to coordinate Christmas gifts or to confirm my attendance at firm galas. "Elena, I'm so sorry to bother you," Brenda said, her voice strained with that professional politeness that hides a growing panic. "But Arthur is..." Well, he's a bit of a whirlwind today. He can't find the garment bag with his tuxedo for the foundation dinner. He says you usually handle the pickup from the French cleaners on 4th. I looked at my fingernails. They were unvarnished, a pale, healthy pink. I hadn't had time to paint them in weeks because I had been too busy coordinating the landscaping for our summer house. I didn't pick it up, Brenda, I said calmly. Oh, I see. Well, could you perhaps call them? They won't release it to me without your authorization on the account. Arthur is quite insistent. He has a board meeting in an hour, and he's losing his temper. I imagined Arthur in his mahogany row office, his face turning that specific shade of pomegranate as he realized a basic necessity of his life hadn't materialized. He had spent decades believing he was a titan of industry, never realizing his titan status was supported by a woman who made sure his shirts were pressed and his social obligations were sanitized. The account is under my name, Brenda, I said, and I've closed it. If Arthur needs his tuxedo, he'll have to open a new account, pay the outstanding balance I left there, and present his own identification. It's time he learned the geography of his own life. I hung up before she could apologize again. This was the first small humiliation I allowed myself to enjoy. It wasn't grand. It wasn't a public shaming. It was simply the removal of a service. I was learning that power doesn't always come from taking action. Sometimes it comes from a total, absolute stillness. 2 hours later, the intercom buzzed. I didn't have to check the camera to know who it was. The rhythm of the buzz was hesitant, then insistent. I opened the door to find Chloe. She wasn't in her gym clothes today. She was dressed in a soft, oatmeal-colored cashmere sweater and perfectly tailored jeans. She looked like a catalog's definition of wholesome. She was holding a small white box from the bakery I liked near the house. "Elena?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Can I come in, please?" I stepped aside. I didn't welcome her, but I didn't bar her entry. She walked into the living room, looking around with a forced sympathy that made my skin crawl. "It's so modern here," she said, placing the bakery box on the glass table. "I brought those almond croissants you love. I went to the house to check on Arthur, and he's in such a state. Julian is worried too. We all are." I sat in the armchair opposite the sofa, crossing my legs. I didn't touch the box. "What is Julian worried about, Chloe?" She sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He thinks you're having some kind of breakdown. He says you're talking about leaks and paperwork, and that you've just abandoned the house. He doesn't understand. I told him it's probably just the stress of the holidays coming up, and maybe some hormonal shifts." She said it with a tilted head, the way one speaks to a confused toddler or a dying pet. The hormonal jab was a classic, a way to invalidate a woman's anger by tethering it to her biology. "Is that what you told him?" I asked. "That I'm just a menopausal woman who forgot how to be a wife?" Chloe's eyes flickered. She wasn't used to me being this blunt. I had always been the one to smooth over the awkward silences at dinner. "No, of course not. I'm on your side, Elena. I know Arthur can be difficult. He's a strong personality. Sometimes men like that don't realize how much they lean on us." Us. The inclusion was like a slap. She was positioning herself as my peer, another woman managing Arthur. "You've been spending a lot of time at the house lately," I said. I watched her closely. I saw the way her pulse quickened at the base of her throat. "I just want to help," she said quickly. "Julian is so busy at the firm and I have the extra time. I thought I could learn from you. You make everything look so effortless. The way you run that household, It's like a machine. A machine requires maintenance, Chloe, I said. And it requires all the parts to move in the same direction. When one part starts grinding against the others, the whole thing seizes up. I leaned forward, the glass of the table reflecting the cold light of the afternoon. I saw the way you looked at the vanity mirror in the guest room yesterday, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The color drained from her face so fast it was almost surgical. She didn't deny it immediately. That was her mistake. She let the silence hang for 3 seconds too long, the exact amount of time it takes for a lie to lose its wings. Elena, I don't know what you think you saw. We were looking at the water damage on the crown molding. Arthur was showing me— I don't care what you were looking at, I interrupted. I care about what I'm looking at right now. I'm looking at a girl who thinks she's found a shortcut to a life she hasn't earned. You think by sliding into my husband's bed, you're sliding into my position. But you forgot one thing. I stood up. I felt taller than I had in years. My position isn't just the house, the pearls, and the prestige. My position is the person who keeps the secrets. And once I stop keeping them, the house, the pearls, and the prestige, they don't belong to Arthur anymore, which means they won't belong to you. Chloe stood up, her breath coming in short, ragged hitches. You wouldn't tell Julian. You love him too much. It would destroy him. It was the ultimate weapon, the child. They always use the child as a human shield. Julian is already destroyed, I said, my voice heavy with a grief I hadn't yet allowed myself to feel. He was destroyed by a father who taught him that women are utilities, and a mother who was too quiet for too long. Telling him the truth isn't the betrayal, Chloe. Letting him live in a lie you've built for him, that's the betrayal. I walked to the door and held it open. Take the croissants. They're too sweet for me. I've developed a taste for something much more bitter lately. She didn't move for a moment. She looked like she wanted to scream, to cry, to throw the box at the wall. But she was a creature of optics, just like Arthur. She picked up the box, her knuckles white, and walked out without looking at me. As I closed the door, I felt the first real tremor in my hands. The psychological insight hit me then, sharp and jagged. They didn't fear my anger. They feared my absence. My anger was something they could argue with, something they could label as hysteria. But my absence was a void they didn't know how to fill. I went back to the desk. I looked at the legal pad. Item 7. The condo in Aspen. Arthur had bought it through a shell company 3 years ago. He told me it was a firm investment. I had found the second set of keys in his golf bag last month. I wondered if Chloe had been there yet, or if she was the reason he bought it. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in a decade. Sarah, it's Elena. I need the name of that private investigator you used during your divorce. No, I'm fine. I'm just finally doing the inventory. I hung up and looked out at the city. The sun was setting, casting long, skeletal shadows across the skyscrapers. I wondered what Arthur was wearing to the foundation dinner tonight. Probably a suit that didn't quite fit, from a drawer he had to rummage through himself. The curiosity hook was no longer about what they were doing. It was about how long it would take for them to realize that I wasn't just leaving. I was taking the floor they were standing on with me. The private investigator, a man named Marcus who looked more like an insurance adjuster than a detective, met me at a small windowless coffee shop 3 blocks from the apartment. He didn't wear a trench coat or a fedora. He wore a sensible fleece vest and carried a slim leather tablet case. He didn't offer sympathy. I liked him instantly for that. "I've done the preliminary sweep of the shared accounts you flagged," Marcus said, his voice a low, steady hum that blended into the hiss of the espresso machine. "You were right about the consulting fees coming out of the secondary LLC. They've been consistent for 24 months. But there's a second stream of capital I think you should look at." He slid a printout across the laminate table. It was a spreadsheet, clean and cold. "What am I looking at?" I asked. "It's a corporate travel account," he explained, pointing to a series of line items. "Registered to the firm, but the billing address is a P.O. box in Julian's name. It's been used for weekend rentals in the city, jewelry purchases, and high-end grocery deliveries to an address in the Heights." The Heights. That was where Chloe and Julian lived. Julian's name is on the box? I felt a small, sharp prick of nausea. I had spent the last 48 hours convincing myself that Julian was a victim, a husband being cuckolded by his own father. "On the box, yes, but the card used to fund it is Arthur's personal line," Marcus said. He looked at me with a flicker of something like pity. "It's a closed loop, Mrs. Sterling. It's designed so that if anyone at the firm looks, it looks like Julian's expenses. If anyone at home looks, it looks like Arthur's business. They're using each other as cover." I stared at the numbers. The psychological insight hit me like a physical blow. The betrayal wasn't just a physical act between a man and his daughter-in-law. It was a structural agreement. My son wasn't just the victim. He was, at the very least, the logistical facilitator of his own shame. Or perhaps he was being paid for his silence. "I need the footage from the house," I said. My voice didn't shake. "The guest room hallway, and the garage." "I'll have it by tomorrow," Marcus replied. I walked back to the apartment in a daze. The city felt louder than usual, the honking of horns and the rush of the wind between the buildings sounding like a chorus of accusations. I had raised Julian to be a man of integrity. I had watched him take his first steps, helped him with his law school applications, and sat in the front row at his wedding, crying tears of joy because I thought he had found a partner who would cherish him. When I entered the apartment, Julian was waiting in the lobby. He looked terrible. His tie was loosened, his eyes were bloodshot, and he had a smudge of what looked like ink on his jaw. He didn't wait for me to speak. He practically lunged at me as soon as I stepped off the elevator. "Mom, you have to talk to him," Julian said, his voice cracking. "Dad is losing it. He missed the board vote this morning. He told Brenna to cancel all his appointments for the week. He's sitting in the library with the lights off, drinking." I walked past him toward my door, my keycard already in hand. "He's a grown man, Julian. If he wants to sit in the dark, let him." "It's not just that." Julian followed me into the apartment, his presence suddenly making the small space feel claustrophobic. "The Millers called. They're pulling their account. They said the dinner last night was uncomfortable. Dad was snapping at Chloe, and Chloe was crying in the bathroom. It was a disaster, Mom. You weren't there to fix it." I turned to face him. I didn't take off my coat. I didn't offer him a drink. "Why was Arthur snapping at Chloe?" I asked. Julian looked away, his gaze landing on a stack of magazines on the coffee table. "I don't know. He's stressed. He thinks you're going to file for divorce and take the firm down with you. He's taking it out on everyone." "And Chloe?" I pressed. "Why was she crying? Is she that fragile?" "She's sensitive, Mom. She feels guilty. She thinks this is somehow her fault because she's been intruding on your space at the house. She was just trying to be a good daughter-in-law." The lie was so thick I could almost taste it. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. They were painting me as the volatile element, the storm that had upended their calm sea. "Julian," I said, walking closer to him. I could smell the scotch on his breath. Do you love your wife? He blinked, startled by the shift in tone. Of course I do. What kind of question is that? And do you respect your father? He's my father, Mom. He built everything we have. Everything I built, I corrected him softly. Arthur hasn't looked at a balance sheet without my guidance in 20 years. He hasn't made a strategic partnership that didn't start with a dinner I hosted. You're all so worried about the firm and the reputation, but has it occurred to you to ask me how I am? Julian looked confused. Not guilty, just genuinely baffled. You're your mom. You're always fine. You're the strongest person I know. That's why this strike or whatever you're doing is so unfair. You're punishing us for things we don't even understand. The exclusion was now complete. In Julian's eyes, I wasn't a person capable of being hurt. I was a pillar. And pillars aren't allowed to crack. If they do, they are punishing the roof they support. I'm not punishing you, Julian, I said. I'm just stopping the maintenance. If the house falls down because I'm not there to hold up the beams, then the house was never structurally sound to begin with. I don't have time for metaphors, Mom, he snapped, his father's temper finally bubbling to the surface. We have the gala in 3 days. If you aren't there, the rumors will start. The partners are already whispering. I need you to come home, apologize to Chloe for whatever you said to her, and help Dad get his head straight. Apologize to Chloe? I felt a cold, sharp laugh start in my chest, but I suppressed it. Instead, I walked to the desk and picked up my legal pad. I turned to a fresh page. I'll tell you what, Julian, I said. I'll consider coming to the gala, but only on one condition. Anything, he said, visible relief washing over his face. What is it? I want the keys to the Aspen condo, I said. The ones in your name. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. The ink smudge on his jaw seemed to darken. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered. The firm owns a property in Aspen, but the one with the P.O. Box billing address, Julian, I said. The one your father pays for. I want the keys. By tonight. Julian's face went a strange, mottled gray. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of the boy he used to be, the one who knew he'd been caught with his hand in the jar. But then, the mask of the corporate associate slid back into place. I'll see what I can do, he said, his voice hollow. He turned and walked out of the apartment. He didn't say goodbye. I sat down at the desk. My hands were perfectly still. I looked at the ledger. Item 8, the Aspen property. I knew what I would find there. It wasn't just a love nest. It was the place where they had buried the money they were skimming from the trust. The money meant for my grandchildren's education. The curiosity hook wasn't about the affair anymore. It was about the depth of the rot. I realized that Arthur and Chloe weren't just betraying my marriage. They were dismantling the family's future, piece by piece. And they had convinced my son to hold the flashlight while they did it. I picked up the phone. Marcus, I have a new address for you to check. And I need to know who else has been flying to Colorado on that corporate account. I looked at the clock. It was 5 p.m. In the house, I would be starting dinner. Here, I was just starting the fire. The downtown apartment had become a fortress of clarity. But a fortress can also be a cage. By the third day, the walls felt like they were pressing in, the city noise outside sounding like a constant, low-frequency interrogation. I realized that to truly dismantle a life, you have to revisit the site of the wreckage. I went back to the house on Thursday morning, specifically at 10:30 a.m. I knew the rhythm of that house better than my own heartbeat. Arthur would be at his mid-morning briefing, and Julian would be in court. It was the hour of the ghosts, the time when the only thing moving in those 10,000 square feet was the dust in the light. When I opened the front door, the first thing I noticed wasn't a sound, but a smell. It was the sharp, metallic tang of scorched sugar. I walked into the kitchen. The site was a quiet, domestic disaster. The heavy copper pots I'd polished for decades were piled in the sink, crusted with the remains of a meal I didn't recognize. On the counter sat my sourdough starter, the one I had told Chloe she would have to feed. The glass jar was shattered on the floor, the pale, fermented dough spreading across the marble like a slow-motion car crash. "Oh, Elena, you're back." I turned. Chloe was standing in the doorway leading to the mudroom. She was wearing one of my silk robes, the navy blue one Arthur bought me in Florence 10 years ago. It was too big for her. The hem dragged on the floor and the sleeves were rolled up in messy, thick cuffs. The psychological insight hit me with the force of a physical weight. She wasn't just sleeping with my husband. She was trying on my life to see if it fit. And she was finding it too heavy. "I'm not back," I said, my voice flat. I looked at the broken jar on the floor. "I'm just collecting a few more things." "I tried to feed it," Chloe said, her voice small and defensive. She didn't move to cover the robe or apologize for wearing it. "The bread thing, it smelled like it was rotting. I tried to move it and the jar slipped. I was going to clean it up, but I have a lunch at the club with the committee ladies. They're expecting you, by the way. I told them I'd stand in." "The committee ladies don't like stand-ins," I said. I walked toward the sink, stepping carefully around the glass. "They like the person who knows their grandchildren's names and which of them is allergic to strawberries. Do you know Mrs. Gable's granddaughter's name, Chloe?" Chloe bit her lip, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "I can learn." "You can't learn 30 years of labor in a weekend," I said. "You think this life is about the robe and the lunch. It's not. It's about the cleaning up, which you haven't done." I walked past her, headed for the library. I didn't look back to see if she followed, but I heard the swish of my silk robe against the floorboards as she trailed behind me. In the library, the air was thick with the scent of Arthur's cigars and expensive scotch. The room looked disheveled, mail piled high on the desk, a half-empty glass marking a ring on the antique leather inlay. My absence was visible in the clutter. For 30 years, I had been the invisible hand that kept the chaos at bay. Now, the chaos was winning. I went to the safe hidden behind the portrait of Arthur's grandfather. I punched in the code, my mother's birth year. It clicked open. Inside were the deeds, the jewelry I rarely wore, and a small, leather-bound diary I hadn't opened in years. But that's not what I was looking for. I reached into the very back, behind a stack of bonds, and pulled out a small, unassuming USB drive. "What is that?" Chloe asked from the doorway. She was leaning against the frame, trying to look casual, but her eyes were fixed on my hand. "Insurance," I said. "Arthur is looking for the Aspen keys," she said, her voice dropping into a more manipulative tone. "Julian said you asked for them. He's very upset, Elena. He thinks you're trying to blackmail him." "Blackmail implies I want something from him," I said, tucking the drive into my handbag.
I don't want anything Arthur has. I'm simply reclaiming what is mine, including my son." Chloe laughed then, a sharp, brittle sound. "You think Julian is yours? He's been helping Arthur hide the Aspen expenses for 18 months. He's not a victim, Elena. He's a partner. He likes the lifestyle. He likes the prestige. He's much more like his father than you want to admit." The exclusion grew colder. It was one thing to suspect Julian's complicity. It was another to hear it confirmed by the woman who was systematically hollowing out my family. She was telling me that I was the outsider, the only one still clinging to the myth of the good Sterling family. "Is that what you tell yourself to feel better about what you're doing?" I asked. "That everyone is as corrupt as you are?" "I'm not corrupt," Chloe snapped, her facade finally cracking. "I'm realistic. Arthur was lonely. You were always busy, managing the house, managing the accounts, managing the image. You became a ghost in your own home, Elena. Don't blame me for walking into a room you vacated years ago." I looked at her, really looked at her.
I saw the insecurity beneath the silk, the desperation of a woman who thought she was winning a prize, only to realize she had inherited a mountain of debt and a man who didn't know how to love anything he couldn't control. "I didn't vacate the room, Chloe," I said softly. "I built the room. And now, I'm taking the walls with me." I walked toward her. For a second, she looked like she might block my way, but I didn't slow down. I walked with the absolute authority of a woman who had walked these halls for 3 decades. She stepped aside at the last possible moment. As I reached the front door, the phone in the hallway began to ring. I checked the caller ID. It was the event planner for the gala. I didn't answer it. I let it ring into the silence of the house. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool morning air hitting my face. I looked at the flower beds. The hydrangeas were drooping, the soil dry and cracked. I had forgotten to tell the gardener about the new watering schedule. I got into my car and sat for a moment, my hand resting on the USB drive in my bag. On it was the security footage Marcus had pulled. The footage of Arthur and Chloe in the guest room, yes, but also footage from the garage. I hadn't watched the garage footage yet. Marcus told me I should do it in private. I started the engine and pulled away. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw the front door of the house open. Chloe stood there, still in my robe, looking small and lost against the backdrop of the massive, silent mansion. The curiosity hook wasn't about the affair anymore. It was about what Marcus had seen in the garage. I drove back to the city, my mind racing. If Julian was helping hide the expenses, was he also watching the footage? Was he the one who had been erasing the tapes? And if so, what had he missed? I reached the apartment and sat at the desk. I plugged the drive into my laptop. My heart was a dull, heavy throb in my chest. I opened the folder labeled Garage, October 14th. The video flickered to life. It was 2 a.m. A car pulled in, not Arthur's and not Julian's. It was a car I didn't recognize. A man got out, and a moment later, the side door opened. It wasn't Arthur who met him. It was Julian. They exchanged a heavy, thick envelope. No words, just a transaction. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath hitching. The man in the car turned his head toward the camera for a split second before getting back in. I recognized him. He was the auditor the firm had hired to investigate the discrepancies in the trust last year. The one who had given us a clean bill of health. My son wasn't just helping hide an affair. He was helping hide a crime. And he had used my trust to do it. I watched the video loop 4 times. Each time, the exchange felt more clinical, more practiced. Julian didn't look like a man under duress. He didn't look like a son being forced into a dark corner by an overbearing father. He looked like a professional. He checked the seal of the envelope, nodded once, and closed the door with the same effortless efficiency I had taught him when he was a boy, learning to be a gentleman. I had taught him to close doors softly so as not to wake the house. I hadn't realized I was teaching him how to hide the sound of a bribe. The psychological weight of this realization was different from the discovery of the affair. The affair was a betrayal of my heart, of my bed, of my dignity. But this was a betrayal of my legacy. I had spent 30 years curating the Sterling name, ensuring that integrity was more than just a word on their letterhead. I had protected them from their own impulses, smoothed over their rough edges, and acted as the moral compass they were too lazy to carry themselves. And now I saw the truth. They hadn't been following my compass. They had just been waiting for me to look away so they could bury it. My phone rang. It wasn't Arthur or Julian. It was Victoria Miller, the matriarch of the family whose account Julian had mentioned earlier. Victoria was my closest social contemporary, a woman who spoke in sighs and expensive floral arrangements. "Elena, darling," Victoria said, her voice a sharp, polished weapon. "I heard you were under the weather. Such a shame, especially with the gala on Saturday. I was calling because Julian mentioned you might need some help with the seating chart. He seemed quite overwhelmed when I saw him at the club this afternoon." She was fishing. In our world, overwhelmed was code for unraveling. "Julian is always a bit dramatic when it comes to logistics, Victoria," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "I'm perfectly fine. Just a lingering cold. The seating chart is already finalized. I have it right here." I didn't have it. I had shredded it 3 days ago. "Oh, wonderful. Because there are rumors, you know. People are saying Arthur looked, well, disheveled at the board meeting. And Chloe was seen leaving the house in tears this morning. You know how people talk. They think there's a crack in the foundation." "People often mistake a renovation for a collapse, Victoria," I said. "We're just moving things around. I'll see you Saturday. I promise it will be a night no one forgets." I hung up. The curiosity hook for Victoria was set. She would be there, eyes wide, waiting for the scandal. But she wouldn't find it in a messy confrontation. She would find it in the silence I was about to leave behind. I spent the rest of the afternoon at the desk. I wasn't writing a ledger anymore. I was building a timeline. 2:14 a.m., October 14th. The bribe. 11:30 p.m., October 20th. Arthur's consulting trip to Aspen. Flights confirmed by Marcus. 3 p.m., Tuesday. The guest room. The pattern was clear. The affair and the embezzlement were two sides of the same coin. Arthur was the ego, Julian was the engine, and Chloe was the catalyst. They had created a closed ecosystem where I was the only variable they couldn't control. They thought they had neutralized me by making me comfortable. They thought the house, the pearls, and the prestige were a cage I would never want to leave. The doorbell buzzed. It was Marcus. When I let him in, he looked tired. He handed me a thick manila folder. I tracked the auditor, the man in the video. His name is Stephen Vance. He retired 2 months after that footage was taken. He's currently living in a villa in Portugal. A villa that was purchased by a holding company registered in your name, Mrs. Sterling. I felt the air leave my lungs. My name? "Your electronic signature is on the purchase agreement," Marcus said, his eyes avoiding mine. "It was authorized from the Home Office computer on a Tuesday evening last November. You were at the opera that night with the governor's wife." The exclusion was now a trap. They hadn't just committed a crime, they had pinned the tale on me. If the firm collapsed, if the trust was investigated, the trail of breadcrumbs led directly to my door. They had used my meticulous nature as a shield, knowing that no one would question a document with my signature. "They think they've won," I whispered. "They've been very thorough," Marcus agreed. "What do you want to do? If we go to the authorities, you'll be the primary suspect until we can prove the signature was forged. That could take years. Your reputation would be destroyed before the first hearing." I walked to the window. The sun was dipping below the skyline, turning the glass towers into pillars of fire. I thought about the gala. I thought about the podium where Arthur would stand and talk about 3 decades of excellence. I thought about Julian standing at his side, the proud son, while Chloe watched from the front row, wearing my jewelry. They expected me to stay quiet to save myself. They were betting on my vanity, my need for decorum, my love for my son. They thought I was too civilized to burn the house down while I was still inside it. "I don't care about the reputation, Marcus," I said, turning back to him. "The reputation is a ghost. I want the truth, and I want them to be the ones who have to explain it." "How?" "The gala," I said. "It's a retirement celebration, isn't it? A look back at Arthur's career. I think it's time we showed the guests some of the work he's been doing behind the scenes." "Mrs. Sterling, that's social suicide." "No," I said, a cold, hard smile touching my lips for the first time in weeks. "It's a funeral, and I'm the only one who knows where the bodies are buried." I walked him to the door. As he left, he hesitated. "Your son, Julian, he's in deep. If you pull this thread, he goes down with Arthur." "My son died a long time ago, Marcus," I said. "I just didn't realize I was raising his ghost." I closed the door and went to the bedroom. I opened the closet and pulled out the dress I had bought for the gala, a deep midnight blue velvet. It was elegant. It was restrained. It was the dress of a woman who knew her place. I picked up a pair of fabric shears from my sewing kit. I didn't shred the dress. I sat on the bed and began to carefully unpick the hem, inch by inch. Beneath the lining, I began to stitch the USB drive and the folded copies of the bank transfers. I was turning my wardrobe into a courier's vest. As I worked, the silence of the apartment felt different. It was no longer the silence of exhaustion. It was the silence of a predator, waiting in the tall grass. The curiosity hook remained. Would Arthur realize the trap before he stepped onto that stage? Or was his ego so massive that he truly believed I would walk into that ballroom and smile for the cameras one last time? I finished the last stitch and held the dress up. It looked perfect. No one would ever know what was hidden inside, just like they never knew what was hidden inside me. Friday morning arrived with a thin gray drizzle that blurred the edges of the skyscrapers. In the house, the rain would have been a melody against the slate roof. Here, it was just a dull, rhythmic slapping against the glass. The first sign that the machine was truly seizing up came at 9 a.m. My personal cell phone, which I had kept on silent, had 17 missed calls. Most were from the house, but one was from the florist we had used for 20 years. I called them back. "Mrs. Sterling, oh, thank goodness," the shop owner, Mr. Henderson, sighed. "The delivery for the gala centerpieces. Arthur called and canceled the orchids. He said you wanted something simpler, like carnations. I just couldn't believe it. You've never ordered a carnation in your life." I stared at my reflection in the window. He canceled the orchids? And the lilies. He said the budget was being restructured. "Elena, is everything all right? It's not like Arthur to micromanage the floral arrangements. He sounded frantic." "The budget isn't being restructured, Mr. Henderson.
I said softly. Arthur is just realizing that beauty is expensive. Go ahead with the orchids, charge them to my private account, and tell the delivery driver to hand the invoice directly to me at the ballroom door, not to Arthur. I hung up. The psychological insight was clear. Arthur was hemorrhaging money. The holding company in Portugal, the bribes, the Aspen condo, the walls were closing in on his liquidity, and he was trying to save pennies by ruining the aesthetics of his own retirement. He was so panicked, he was willing to look cheap in front of the very people he spent his life trying to impress. An hour later, the intercom buzzed. I didn't even have to look. I knew it was the bridge coming to fetch me. Julian didn't look like a high-powered attorney today. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His skin had a sallow, translucent quality, and his hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his overcoat. "You look tired, Julian," I said, stepping back to let him into the apartment. "We're all tired, Mom," he said, walking straight to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. His movements were jerky, lacking his usual practiced grace. "Dad's a mess. Chloe is staying at her mother's. The house feels like a tomb. Can we just stop this? Please?" "Stop what?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "The silence, the legal pad, the moving out. Dad wants to apologize. He told me everything." I raised an eyebrow. "Everything?" Julian set the glass down on the counter with a sharp clack. "He said he had a lapse in judgment with Chloe. He said it was a moment of weakness, fueled by the stress of the retirement and feeling like you had checked out of the marriage. He's devastated, Mom. He's willing to go to counseling, to sign whatever postnuptial agreement you want. Just don't do this to him at the gala." The exclusion was now a performance. Arthur had fed Julian a sanitized version of the betrayal, a lapse in judgment, and Julian was swallowing it because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. He was choosing the lie to protect the structure. "And what about the auditor, Julian?" I asked. My voice was a low, steady vibration. "Was that also a lapse in judgment? The envelope in the garage at 2 a.m.? Julian froze. The water in his glass was still swirling, but he had turned into a statue. He didn't look at me. He looked at the sink. "I don't know what you're talking about," he whispered. "I have the footage, Julian. I have the bank records. I know about the house in Portugal. I know you used my signature to buy an auditor's silence." I took a step toward him. The air in the room felt thick, as if the oxygen were being replaced by the weight of the truth. "You didn't just help him cheat on me," I said. "You helped him steal from your own children's future. You helped him turn me into a criminal. Why, Julian? Did you think you'd inherit the throne faster if the foundation was built on rot?" Julian finally looked at me. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a desperate, cornered kind of anger. "He was going to lose it all, Mom. The firm had a shortfall, a miscalculation in the pension fund. If the auditor had flagged it, Dad would have gone to prison. The Sterling name would have been a joke. I did what I had to do to save us." "You didn't save us," I said. "You saved a facade, and you sacrificed me to do it." "You were the logical choice," Julian snapped, his voice rising for the first time. "No one suspects you. You're the saint of the suburbs. If the paperwork ever came to light, we could have said you were confused, that you were managing the accounts and made a mistake. We could have protected you. We would have protected you." The psychological cruelty of his logic was breathtaking. They had used my reputation as a shield, and they had already pre-planned the confusion and mistake defense, a way to gaslight the world into thinking I was losing my mind so they could keep their hands clean. "You're my son," I whispered. And he's my father, Julian yelled. He gave me everything. This life, this career, it all comes from him. What did you give me, Mom? You gave me iron shirts and Sunday dinners. You gave me the manners to talk to people like the Millers. But Dad gave me power. He stood there, chest heaving, realizing too late that he had finally said the truth out loud. The exclusion was total now. I wasn't his mother. I was the domestic labor that made his power look polite. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I felt a strange, cold sensation, as if a part of my heart had finally crystallized into stone. I see, I said. I walked to the door and opened it. Thank you for the clarity, Julian. It makes what I have to do much easier.
What are you going to do? Julian asked, his voice suddenly small again, the fear returning. Are you going to the police? I'm going to the gala, I said. And I want you to tell Arthur that I'll be there. Tell him I accept his apology. Tell him I'll play my part one last time. I want the whole family together on that stage when he gives his speech. Julian searched my face, looking for a trap. But I had spent 30 years perfecting the mask of the supportive wife. He saw only what he wanted to see. A woman who had been broken into submission. Good, he said, adjusting his coat. That's the right choice, Mom. For everyone. He walked out. I waited until I heard the elevator doors close. Then, I went to the closet and pulled out the midnight blue velvet dress. I ran my fingers over the hidden seam where the USB drive and the records were tucked away. The dependency was the final piece of the puzzle. They needed me to be the saint of the suburbs one last time to validate their lies. They were so dependent on my silence that they couldn't imagine a world where I would choose to destroy myself just to ensure they fell with me. The curiosity hook was no longer about the crime. It was about the gala. I picked up the phone and dialed Marcus. It's on, I said. I need you to get the original files to the AV technician at the hotel. He's a young man, works for the catering company. He's struggling with his student loans. I've already sent him a retention bonus from an anonymous account. Are you sure about this, Elena? Marcus asked. There's no coming back from this. I don't want to come back, I said, looking out at the rain. I want to see what happens when the machine finally stops. I hung up. I sat on the bed and began to polish my mother's pearls. They were cold against my skin, a reminder of a generation that stayed quiet no matter the cost. I wasn't that woman anymore. Saturday morning was too bright. The sun was an intruder, cutting through the sheer curtains of the apartment with a sterile, unforgiving heat. It was the day of the gala, the day the world would celebrate 35 years of Arthur Sterling's unassailable legacy. At 10 a.m., the doorbell rang. It wasn't a frantic buzz this time. It was the confident, rhythmic press of a man who believed he had successfully negotiated a peace treaty. I opened the door to Arthur. He looked better than he had in my memory of the previous days. He was wearing a fresh suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, and he was carrying a long, velvet-covered jewelry box. He looked like the man I had married, the man who believed that any emotional wound could be sutured with a high-end retail purchase. Elena, he said, stepping into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. He didn't look at the legal pads still sitting on the desk. He didn't look at the cold, empty kitchen. He looked at me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile he usually reserved for difficult clients.
I've missed you. The house it's not a home without you." I stood by the door, my hands folded in front of me. "The house is a structure, Arthur. It's exactly what we made it." He chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "Always so philosophical. Look, I know things have been strained. Julian told me you're coming tonight. It's the right move, Elle, for the family, for the firm, and for us." He placed the jewelry box on the coffee table and clicked it open. Inside was a necklace of sapphires and diamonds, stones so heavy they looked like they would bruise the skin. "To match your dress," he said. "A symbol of a new chapter. We'll get through this. I've spoken to Chloe. She's moving out of the guest room. She and Julian are going to take a long trip after the gala, some time to recalibrate." The psychological insight hit me with a sharp, cold clarity. Arthur wasn't apologizing. He was reorganizing the furniture. In his mind, the affair was a logistical error that had been corrected. He had handled Chloe by sending her away with Julian, and he was handling me with a necklace that probably cost more than the average annual salary. He was so dependent on his own narrative of power that he truly believed I could be bought back into the role of the silent partner. "It's beautiful, Arthur," I said, walking over to the table. I didn't touch the stones. "But sapphires are so cold, don't you think?" "They're timeless," he replied, his voice regaining its authoritative edge. "Like us. I've already sent the car for your things. We'll go to the hotel at 3 to get ready in the suite. The governor is arriving at 6. I need you on my arm, Elena. No more talk of leaks or paperwork. Let's just put this week behind us." He reached out to touch my shoulder, and I didn't flinch. I let him. I felt the weight of his hand, the hand that had held Chloe, the hand that had signed the forged documents, the hand that was now patting me as if I were a loyal retriever who had finally come home after a brief, confusing run in the woods. "I'll be there, Arthur," I said. "I'll play my part." He beamed, the relief visible in the way his shoulders finally dropped. He thought he had won. He thought my silence was the silence of defeat, not the silence of a fuse burning toward a cache of dynamite. The imbalance of power in that room was staggering. He felt like a king reclaiming a province. I felt like a ghost watching a man walk through a graveyard. By 4 p.m., we were in the presidential suite of the Grand Hotel. The air was thick with the scent of hairspray and expensive cologne. A stylist was working on my hair, pinning it into a chignon that felt like a helmet. Across the room, Arthur was practicing his speech in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror, his voice a low murmur of integrity, service, and family values. A knock at the door signaled the arrival of Julian and Chloe. They walked in like actors entering a stage. Julian was in his tuxedo looking stiff and miserable, while Chloe was wrapped in a coat of pale faux fur, her eyes darting around the room until they landed on me. She looked terrified, but she was trying to hide it behind a mask of youthful arrogance. "Mom," Julian said, walking over to kiss my cheek. He smelled of peppermint, the scent he always used to hide the smell of tobacco when he started smoking again under stress. "You look amazing. The sapphires are perfect." "Thank you, Julian," I said. I looked past him to Chloe. She stepped forward, her voice a fragile whisper. "Elena, I'm so glad you're here. I wanted to say I'm sorry for the bread starter. It was a mistake. Everything was a mistake." She was using the mistake language Julian had coached her on. It was a word that absolved them of intent. A mistake is something that happens to you. A betrayal is something you do. "Don't worry about the starter, Chloe,"
I said, my voice sweet and lethal. I've realized that some things aren't meant to be kept alive. They're meant to be replaced. I saw the flicker of panic in her eyes before Arthur called them over to check the program. The dependency of the family on my performance was now total. As we prepared to go down to the ballroom, they were all watching me, gauging my mood, waiting for a sign of a crack. When I smiled at the photographer who came to the suite for family shots, I could practically hear their collective sigh of relief. They were so blinded by their need for me to be okay that they didn't notice I hadn't eaten a single bite of the tray of hors d'oeuvres they had ordered. They didn't notice that I wasn't drinking the champagne. I was focused on the weight of the dress, the velvet hidden seams where the truth was waiting. As we reached the elevator, Arthur took my hand. His palm was slightly damp. "Ready?" he asked. "More than you know," I replied. We stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, and for a moment, the four of us were trapped in the mirrored box. I looked at our reflections. We looked perfect. The patriarch, the matriarch, the successful son, the beautiful daughter-in-law. We were the American dream, polished to a high shine. But as the elevator descended, I felt the first real surge of adrenaline. Marcus had texted me 5 minutes ago. "The AV tech is ready. The file is loaded. We go live after the third toast." The curiosity hook was no longer about whether I would do it. It was about what would happen to Julian. As I looked at him in the mirror, I saw the little boy who used to hide behind my legs when he was scared. He was still hiding. But tonight, there would be no legs to hide behind. I was moving out of the way. The elevator chimed. The doors opened to a wall of camera flashes and the roar of 1,000 conversations. Arthur straightened his tie. Julian took Chloe's arm. I stepped out first. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel was a cavern of gold leaf and crystal, designed to make even the most powerful men feel slightly smaller than the architecture. Tonight, it was filled with 300 of the city's elite, the people who moved the money, wrote the laws, and decided whose names stayed on the buildings. As we entered, the sound of the room shifted. It wasn't a hush. It was a rhythmic swell of attention, a collective inhale as the Sterlings took their place. Arthur's hand was firm on my elbow, guiding me through the crowd like a prize-winning vessel. He was in his element. He stopped every 3 feet to clasp a hand, to share a booming laugh, to drop a calculated compliment. And I was there, the silent, elegant anchor. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I tilted my head with practiced interest when a donor's wife spoke about her charity for orphaned labs. "You're doing beautifully, Elle," Arthur whispered during a rare gap between guests. He squeezed my arm, just a bit too hard. "Keep this up." The Millers are at table 4. Victoria looks like she's hunting for blood. Go over there, charm her, and make sure she knows we're looking forward to their anniversary gala next month. The psychological insight hit me as I looked at him. Arthur didn't just need me for the optics. He needed me for the emotional labor he was too arrogant to perform himself. He could win a boardroom with a spreadsheet and a threat, but he couldn't maintain a social network without the soft power I provided. He was utterly dependent on my ability to sanitize his reputation. Yet, he treated that ability as a natural resource he was entitled to mine until it was dry. "Of course, Arthur," I said. I walked toward table 4. Victoria Miller was seated there, her diamonds flashing under the chandelier like warning lights. She watched me approach with the narrowed eyes of a woman who had seen many dynasties fall and was waiting for the first sign of smoke from ours. "Elena," she said, her voice a sharp, dry whine. "I must say,
You look radiant. That blue is quite a statement. Very Ice Queen, isn't it? It's velvet, Victoria, I said, taking the seat next to her. It absorbs the light. It's much more practical than silk when you're expecting a long evening. Is that what we're expecting? A long evening? She leaned in, her perfume, something heavy and expensive, crowding my space. I saw Julian earlier. He looks like he's aged 10 years since the board meeting. And Arthur, well, Arthur is performing. He's a bit too loud, don't you think? Like a man trying to drown out a noise only he can hear. I looked across the room. Arthur was holding court near the governor, his gestures expansive. Arthur has always been a man of grand gestures, Victoria, I said. He believes that if you build the stage large enough, no one will notice the cracks in the floorboards. Victoria's eyes sharpened. She heard the subtext. In our world, acknowledging a crack is a revolutionary act.
And you, Elena? What do you believe? I believe in the truth, I said, standing up. Even when it's inconvenient. Enjoy the first course, Victoria. I hear the lobster is excellent tonight. I walked away before she could reply. I felt the weight of the USB drive against my ribs, a secret heartbeat beneath the velvet. The dinner began with a series of minor toasts, meaningless tributes to vision and growth. I sat at the head table, flanked by Arthur on my right and Julian on my left. Chloe was seated next to Julian, her face pale, her hands trembling as she picked at her salad. She looked like a ghost at her own feast. "Mom," Julian whispered, leaning toward me. "You're being too quiet. People are noticing. Talk to the governor's wife. She's been trying to get your attention for 5 minutes. I have nothing to say to her, Julian, I said, not looking at him. For God's sake, just play the part, he hissed, his father's temper flaring in his eyes. We're almost there. Just 2 more hours and we're clear. Don't ruin this now. The imbalance of our dynamic was now a physical pressure. Julian wasn't asking me for help. He was demanding my subservience to save his own skin. He was so terrified of losing the life he had earned through bribes and silence that he was willing to bully his own mother into a performance. You're right, Julian, I said, turning to him with a smile that felt like a blade. We're almost there. The first toast ended. The second toast, given by the senior partner of the firm, was a rambling history of Arthur's integrity. I watched Arthur's face as the man spoke. He was nodding, his eyes moist with a self-congratulatory pride that was genuinely nauseating. He truly believed he deserved this. He had lived the lie for so long that he had become his own greatest fan. As the second toast finished, I caught the eye of a young man in a black vest standing near the sound booth. He was the AV technician Marcus had contacted. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. My heart hammered against the velvet. And now, the MC announced, his voice booming through the speakers, we have a special surprise. A tribute film put together by the family, celebrating the man behind the legacy. Arthur, if you'd join us at the podium. Arthur stood up, buttoning his jacket with a flourish. He looked at me, his eyes shining with triumph. Watch this, Elle. This was Julian's idea. A real tearjerker. He walked to the podium. The lights in the ballroom began to dim. A hush fell over the 300 guests as the giant screen lowered behind Arthur. Julian leaned back in his chair, a look of relief finally washing over his face. He thought this was the final act of the cover-up. He thought the film would show black and white photos of Arthur holding him as a baby, clips of the summer house, and staged testimonials of his charitable heart. but I knew what was on the drive Marcus had delivered. The first image appeared on the screen. It wasn't a family photo. It was a high-resolution scan of a bank transfer, the one from the holding company in Portugal to the auditor's account. The ballroom remained silent for a heartbeat, the audience confused, waiting for the sentimental transition. Arthur, standing at the podium, couldn't see the screen behind him. He was looking out at the crowd, a humble smile plastered on his face. Arthur Sterling, the MC's voice had been pre-recorded for the intro. A man whose word is his bond. Then the audio changed. It wasn't the MC's voice anymore. It was the sound of a garage door opening. On the screen, the bank transfer faded into the security footage from October 14th, 2 a.m. I saw Julian stiffen beside me. I heard Chloe gasp, a small, choked sound that was swallowed by the sudden, collective intake of breath from 300 people. On the screen, my son stepped into the frame, carrying a heavy white envelope. Arthur turned around. He looked at the screen, his mouth falling open. He didn't move. He looked like a man watching his own execution in slow motion. The curiosity hook was no longer about the secret. It was about the reaction. The room was no longer a ballroom. It was a courtroom. And for the first time in 35 years, I wasn't the one keeping the peace. I was the one who had finally let the silence speak. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The water was cold. It was the only thing in the room that felt real. The video didn't stop. It transitioned to the guest room hallway. Arthur? Julian's voice was a ragged sob next to me. Mom, what did you do? I didn't answer him. I didn't even look at him. I looked at Arthur, who was now gripping the sides of the podium so hard his knuckles were white. He looked out at the sea of faces, the governor, the Millers, the partners, and he saw the exact moment his life turned into ash. The second toast had ended. The third toast was about to begin. But it wouldn't be a toast to his life. It would be a toast to the end of it. The silence in the ballroom was no longer the silence of respect. It was the silence of a vacuum. It sucked the air out of the room, leaving 300 of the city's most influential people gasping in a shared, televised horror. On the screen, the footage had shifted. It was no longer the grainy black and white of the garage. It was the high-definition clarity of the guest room hallway. The camera angle was tilted, a perspective only an observant woman who knew the geometry of her own home could have chosen. We saw Arthur, still in his silver-haired dignity, lead Chloe into the room. We saw the way he checked the hallway, the way he looked directly toward the camera without seeing it, his eyes filled with a reckless, predatory entitlement. And then, the door clicked shut. The audio wasn't muted. The AV technician had boosted the game. You could hear the rustle of silk, the very robe Chloe had been wearing in the kitchen. You could hear the low, rhythmic murmur of Arthur's voice, a tone of intimacy he hadn't used with me in 15 years. I felt Julian's hand seize my wrist. His grip was frantic, his fingernails digging into my skin through the velvet of my sleeve. "Stop it," he hissed, his voice trembling with a level of terror I had never heard from him, not even when he was a child. "Mom, please, stop it. You're killing us. You're killing everything." I turned my head slowly to look at him. Up close, I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip, the way his pupils had shrunk to pinpricks. He wasn't worried about my heart.
He wasn't worried about the betrayal of his marriage. He was watching his career, his inheritance, and his freedom dissolve into light and sound on a 30-foot screen. "I'm not the one who killed it, Julian," I said, my voice a calm, melodic contrast to the carnage behind us. "I'm just the one who stopped pretending it's alive." I pulled my wrist away. The movement was effortless. He was too weak to hold me. At the podium, Arthur had finally moved. He lunged toward the laptop at the side of the stage, screaming for the tech to shut it off. But the tech, the young man with the student loans, was nowhere to be found. He had already exited through the service doors, his job done. Arthur's hands scrambled over the keyboard, but the file was locked. It was a loop, programmed to play until the end of the directory. And the directory was deep. The screen flickered to a new image, a series of spreadsheets. These weren't the sanitized versions Arthur showed the board. These were the internal ledgers Marcus had helped me recover. Columns of red, highlighted names of politicians who had received consulting fees, and the specific line items for the Aspen condo maintenance. The governor stood up. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at Arthur. He simply buttoned his coat and walked toward the exit, his security detail forming a phalanx around him. Like a signal, the rest of the room began to follow. The elite don't stay for the explosion. They move away from the blast radius before the smoke clears. "Elena!" Arthur's voice boomed over the speakers. He had grabbed the microphone, forgetting it was still live. His voice echoed through the ballroom, distorted and monstrous. "Elena, what have you done? You crazy, vindictive woman! This is your life too! You're destroying yourself!" I stood up. I didn't look at him. I looked at the table. Chloe was slumped in her chair, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, jagged sobs. She looked small. For all her talk of being realistic and modern, she hadn't realized that when a titan falls, he crushes everyone standing in his shadow. I reached out and picked up my evening bag. I adjusted the strap over my shoulder. "It's not my life, Arthur," I said, though I didn't need the microphone for him to hear me. The room was so quiet now that my whisper felt like a shout. "It was a costume I wore for you, and it's become far too heavy." I began to walk. I walked past Victoria Miller, who was standing frozen by her table, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting between me and the screen with a mixture of shock and a dark, clinical fascination. I didn't nod. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't owe her the performance anymore. As I reached the center of the ballroom, Julian caught up to me. He grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. "You can't just leave," he screamed. People were watching. The remaining guests were filming us with their phones, the ultimate modern humiliation. "The police are going to come for the records, Mom. They're going to see your name on the holding company. They'll arrest you." I looked at my son, the man who had been willing to let his mother go to prison to save his own prestige. The psychological insight was a cold, hard diamond in my chest. He still thought he could scare me into protecting him. He didn't understand that a woman who has lost everything is no longer afraid of the dark. "Let them come, Julian," I said. "I've already sent the original unforged documents to the district attorney. I sent them an hour ago, along with the browser history from the home office showing exactly who was logged in when those electronic signatures were made. It wasn't me, Julian. It was you, from your laptop, using my credentials." Julian's face went white. His hand dropped from my shoulder as if I had turned into fire. You turned me in?" "I gave them the truth," I said. "What they do with it is up to the law. I think you should go find a very good lawyer, Julian.
Though I imagine the firm's retainers are going to be busy with your father for the foreseeable future. I turned and continued toward the double doors. The curiosity hook was no longer about the scandal. It was about the destination. The world behind me was in flames. A 35-year empire reduced to a series of embarrassing clips and damning spreadsheets. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the lobby. The air here was cooler, smelling of floor wax and lilies. The chaos of the ballroom was muffled, reduced to a dull, frantic hum. I walked toward the main entrance of the hotel. The doorman, who had seen me arrive in a limousine on Arthur's arm, looked at me with confusion as I walked out alone, my velvet dress sweeping the marble. "Your car, Mrs. Sterling?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'll take a taxi." I stood on the curb of the city street. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement shimmering like black silk. A yellow cab pulled up, its brakes squealing softly. As I got in, I looked back at the hotel. High above, in the windows of the ballroom, I could see the flickering blue light of the screen still playing its loop. Arthur was probably still up there, screaming into a dead microphone, trying to command a room that was already empty. "Where to, lady?" the driver asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. He saw the sapphires. He saw the velvet. He saw the woman who looked like she belonged at the top of the world. I leaned back into the cracked vinyl seat. I felt the weight of the dress, but for the first time, I didn't feel the weight of the secrets. "The airport," I said. "And don't rush. I've spent my whole life being on time for other people. I'd like to see what it's like to be late for once." The cab pulled away from the curb. I reached up and unclipped the sapphire necklace. I didn't throw it out the window. That would be too dramatic, too much like a movie. I simply put it in my bag. It was an asset. And I was going to need every asset I had for the paperwork that was yet to come. I looked out the window as the city lights blurred past. The story wasn't over. The fallout would take months. The trials, the depositions, the frantic phone calls from a son who would eventually realize that a mother's love isn't a blank check. But as the taxi climbed the ramp toward the terminal, I closed my eyes. The leak had finally been fixed. The house had collapsed, and I was finally standing in the sun. The airport hotel was a sanctuary of anonymity. It was a place designed for people in transit, people between lives, people who didn't want to be found. I checked in under my maiden name, Elena Vance. It felt strange on my tongue, like a vintage garment that had been tucked away in cedar for so long it had lost the shape of my body. I didn't fly anywhere that night. I wasn't ready for a different climate. I was only ready for a different silence. I sat in the corner of the hotel bar, a space of dim amber lights and the low hum of a news cycle I was currently dominating. Above the bar, a television was muted, but I could see the scroll at the bottom of the screen. Sterling Group Gala ends in scandal. Allegations of fraud and infidelity. There was a blurry photo of Arthur at the podium, looking like a man who had seen a ghost. My phone, tucked into the side pocket of my bag, was a living thing. It vibrated with a rhythmic, desperate energy. 32 missed calls from Julian, 14 from Arthur, 6 from the firm's lead counsel. I took the phone out and laid it on the small, circular table. I didn't turn it off. I wanted to see the waves of their panic hit the shore. I wanted to observe the exact moment when their anger turned into the realization that I was the only one who could navigate the storm I had created. The psychological insight came as I watched the screen light up again. Calling. Julian. In the architecture of our family, I was the keel of the ship. They had spent decades throwing weight onto one side, confident that I would always right the vessel. Now that I had stepped off, they were realizing that the ship wasn't just listing, it was capsizing. Their dependency on me wasn't just for comfort, It was for their very existence. Without me to manage the narrative, they were just men drowning in their own choices. I finally answered on the 33rd call. "Mom? Mom, where are you?" Julian's voice was a jagged, high-pitched mess. He sounded like he was standing outside. I could hear the rush of wind and the distant sirens. "The police are at the house. They have a warrant for the server. Dad he's in the hospital. He had a panic attack or a heart attack. They don't know yet. They're calling it a cardiac event." I took a sip of my club soda. The bubbles were sharp and clean. "Which hospital, Julian?" "St. Jude's. But Mom, you have to come. The lawyers are asking about the Portugal files. They say the digital signatures were traced to my IP, but they're encrypted. You're the only one with the secondary keys. You have to tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you gave me permission." The imbalance of the request was almost comical. He was asking me to commit perjury to save him from the crime he had committed against me. He was still trying to use me as a human shield, even after I had pulled the trigger. "I didn't give you permission, Julian," I said softly. "I gave you an education. I gave you a moral framework. You chose to trade them for a corner office and your father's approval. You're an adult. You're a partner at a firm. Handle it." "Mom, don't do this. I'm your son. If I go down, the Sterling name is finished. Everything you worked for, every dinner party, every committee, it'll all be a joke. Is that what you want? To be remembered as the woman who destroyed her own family?" "I'll be remembered as the woman who survived it," I said. "The Sterling name was already a joke, Julian. I was just the only one who wasn't laughing." I hung up. I felt a sudden, heavy fatigue. It was the kind of exhaustion that lives in the marrow, the result of carrying the emotional weight of 3 people for 3 decades. I looked down at my hands. They were steady, but they felt light, as if the gravity of the house on 4th Street had finally let go of me. I stood up and walked to the elevators. As I waited, a woman stood next to me, a weary traveler in a business suit, clutching a laptop bag. She looked at me, her eyes lingering on the velvet of my dress, which looked absurdly out of place in an airport hotel. "Long night?" she asked, her voice tired but kind. "The longest of my life," I replied. "Going somewhere far?" "I think I'm already there," I said. The elevator chimed. I went up to the 12th floor. The room was small, beige, and utterly devoid of history. I stripped off the midnight blue velvet dress. I felt the USB drive and the records still tucked into the lining. The physical weight of the truth. I folded the dress neatly and placed it on the luggage rack. I lay in bed, the sheets smelling of industrial bleach. For the first time in 34 years, I didn't have to wonder if Arthur was lying to me. I didn't have to wonder if Julian was disappointed in me. I didn't have to worry about the leak in the guest room. But as the room grew dark, a new tension began to accumulate. It was the tension of the aftermath. I knew Arthur. He was a man of immense wounded ego. A cardiac event was his classic move, a way to shift the narrative from villainy to victimhood. He would use his health to guilt me back to his bedside. He would use the lawyers to claim I was a scorned woman who had tampered with the evidence. And then there was Chloe. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text message. Not from Julian. From Chloe. "Elena, please. I'm at the house. I can't get out. There are reporters everywhere. Julian won't talk to me. He says this is all my fault. He's scaring me. Please tell me what to do. I stared at the screen. The curiosity hook was a sharp, uncomfortable tug. I had expected Julian to turn on his father, or even on me, but I hadn't fully considered what he would do to the woman who had been the catalyst for his downfall. Julian had his father's temper, but he lacked his father's control. I looked at the clock. It was 1:14 a.m. I thought about the house I had cleaned, decorated, and defended. I thought about the girl in the kitchen, wearing my robe, crying over a broken jar of sourdough. I realized then that the withdrawal wasn't as simple as checking into a hotel. To truly dismantle the structure, I had to ensure that the people left inside didn't tear each other apart before the law could get to them. Or perhaps, that was exactly what I should let happen. The psychological insight was chilling. I found that I didn't care if the house burned down with them in it. But I did care about the robe. I wanted my silk robe back. I picked up the phone and dialed the one person I knew would be awake and impartial. Marcus, it's Elena. I need you to go back to the house. Not for records. I need you to get someone out of there before my son does something he can't bribe his way out of. I sat up in the dark, the quiet of the hotel room suddenly feeling like a countdown. The story wasn't just about my exit. It was about the vacuum I had left behind, a space so large that the people remaining were beginning to collapse into it. Sunday morning arrived with the clinical, unhurried light of a hospital room. I didn't go to the house first. I went to St. Jude's. I had swapped the velvet for a charcoal wool suit, the kind of outfit that said I was here to discuss a contract, not a recovery. Arthur was in a private wing, the kind of suite where the machines hum with an expensive, muted rhythm. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, tucked under the white sheets, his skin the color of old parchment. He wasn't having a heart attack. The doctors had called it acute stress-induced arrhythmia, a fancy term for a man who had finally realized that his lies were no longer holding up the ceiling. When I walked in, he turned his head slowly. For a second, a flicker of the old Arthur returned, the one who expected me to bring him his slippers and a glass of water. "Elena?" he rasped, his hand twitching on the bed rail. "Thank God. The lawyers, they're saying the DA is moving fast. You have to retract the files. Tell them it was a hack. Tell them you were confused. I've already drafted a statement about your exhaustion." I didn't sit down. I stood at the foot of the bed, looking at the monitor. His heart rate was a steady, rhythmic spike. "I'm not exhausted, Arthur," I said, "and I'm not confused. I'm the most lucid person in this family." "You don't understand," he hissed, his face reddening. "The firm is underwater. Without the Portugal accounts, we're bankrupt. Everything, the house, the cars, the Aspen place, it's all collateralized. If I go down, you go down. You'll be penniless, Elena. Do you want to spend your 70s in a studio apartment?" This was his final weapon, the fear of poverty. He truly believed that my loyalty was a commodity he had purchased with a suburban mansion. "I won't be in a studio apartment, Arthur," I said. I opened my handbag and pulled out a single, thin blue folder. "Because I don't own a share of the Sterling Group. I haven't for 5 years." He frowned, the confusion clouding his eyes. "What are you talking about? Your name is on every major asset." "My name is on the deeds, yes," I said. "But the debt? The debt belongs to the holding companies, the ones you and Julian used to hide the miscalculations. And those holding companies? They were bought out 6 months ago." I laid the blue folder on his lap. He looked at it as if it were a bomb. "Who bought them?" he whispered.
The Vance Group, I said. My father's estate. I didn't spend my inheritance on jewelry or trips, Arthur. I spent it buying the distressed debt of my own husband's firm. Every time you skimmed from the trust to pay for Chloe's jewelry or the Aspen taxes, you were actually borrowing from me at a very high interest rate. The psychological insight hit him like a physical blow. He had spent years thinking he was outsmarting his silent wife, never realizing that I was the one providing the rope he was using to hang himself. He wasn't a titan. He was a tenant in a life I had quietly foreclosed on. You own it? Arthur's voice was barely audible. Everything? I own the firm, the house, and the cars, I said. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, the Vance Group has filed for the immediate liquidation of the Sterling Group's assets. I'm not divorcing you for half of what you have, Arthur. I'm evicting you from everything I own. I walked to the door. The doctors say you'll be discharged tomorrow.
There will be a car waiting for you. It won't take you to 4th Street. It will take you to a small furnished apartment in the Heights. It's already paid for 1 month. After that, I suggest you find a use for those consulting skills you've been bragging about. I didn't wait for his scream. I left him there, the machines finally beginning to beep with the frantic pace of his realization. I drove to the house one last time. The police had left, but the silence that remained was heavy and toxic. I walked into the kitchen. Marcus was there, leaning against the counter. He gave me a somber nod. Julian? I asked.
He left an hour ago, Marcus said. He's at a hotel near the airport. He took his laptop and a suitcase. He didn't say where he was going.
And Chloe? Marcus pointed toward the mudroom. Chloe was sitting on a packing crate, her faux fur coat pulled tight around her. She looked like she had aged 20 years in 24 hours. I walked over to her. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt the same detached pity I felt for a bird that had flown into a window. The car is outside, Chloe, I said. It will take you to your mother's. I've had your personal things packed. They're in the trunk. She looked up at me, her eyes red and hollow. Why didn't you stop us, Elena? If you knew, if you owned everything, why did you let it go this far? The psychological truth was the hardest thing to say. Because I needed to see if there was anything worth saving, I said. I kept feeding the machine, hoping one of you would notice that the fuel was my life. But you didn't. You just kept taking. I didn't stop you because I wanted to see exactly how much you thought I was worth. And the answer was nothing. She looked down at her hands. I'm sorry. I know, I said. But sorry doesn't fix the leak. I watched her walk out. I watched the car pull away. I was alone in the house.
10,000 square feet of history, of furniture I had chosen, of rooms I had curated. I walked upstairs to my bedroom. I went to the closet. My silk robe was lying on the floor, discarded in a heap near the laundry basket. I picked it up. It felt cold and limp. I walked to the guest room and looked at the vanity mirror, the one where I had seen the reflection that changed everything. I saw myself in the glass. I didn't look like an emotionally exhausted woman anymore. I looked like a woman who had finally finished the paperwork. I walked back downstairs to the kitchen. I looked at the broken jar of sourdough on the floor. I picked up a broom and began to sweep. I didn't call the maid. I didn't call a service. I did it myself. The rhythmic sound of the bristles against the marble, the only heartbeat in the house. I realized the twist wasn't that I had won. The twist was that I didn't want any of it. I finished sweeping the glass. I put the robe in a trash bag. I walked out of the front door and locked it. I didn't look back at the hydrangeas or the stained glass. I got into my car and drove to a small, independent bakery 3 towns over. I walked in and asked the girl behind the counter for a fresh starter. "Making something special?" she asked, smiling. "No," I said, the sun finally hitting my face as I stepped back out into the world. "I'm just starting over, and this time, I'm the only one in the kitchen." As I drove away, I looked at the legal pad in the passenger seat. There was only one item left on the ledger. Item 9. Myself. I crossed it off. The debt was paid.